Hi, good evening, everybody. It's not often I get to do a presentation with a beer in my hand, so at 7:30 at night, so I'm really excited. It's not going to be a sales pitch, I'll tell you that right up front, but I'm happy to actually be with the formal gentlemen. I know both of them and respect them well in their products, and I am the Chief Technology Officer for Bit9. Been at Bit9 for 6 years, a quick little pedigree there. Prior to that, I was Chief Scientist for a company called SiteAdvisor. We were acquired by a company called McAfee, so small little company. And interestingly enough, just to further what Engen was saying earlier, at SiteAdvisor we developed a set of sandbox technologies. We had a whole data center filled with sandboxes, and essentially what I had built was a system to download every file on the internet, every file, and just detonate it. Very simple task. And what I learned about 6 months into it is files I knew to be bad stopped looking bad. And what's one of the things that's interesting is, and we're going to talk a little bit about the landscape, and it has changed, and it is scary, and it is dangerous, and all of that stuff, but they're really not as smart as you might think they are. So I sat there, we were using VMware. We're using virtualization to do our sandboxing. And I thought, gosh, how are the attackers, this malware, knowing that they're sitting in a VM and there's the red pill code and all these things? So I literally, after painstakingly spending a weekend drinking probably more beers than I should have, I Googled how to detect if I'm in VMware. And I took the top 3 results and I coded against those. And it stopped 95% of the malware from detecting that I was in malware. Because that's, honestly, there are many different types of attackers, and most of them are not really that smart. And it's something we're going to talk about. What I want to talk about, though, and what's changed, title of the topic, the assumption of breach, often known as the inevitability of compromise. And this is a posture that is new for us in the security space. I sell security software. We all sell security software here. We want to go out, and for years I went out and said, install our software to stop the attack. You want to keep the enemy outside the gates. Well, what's changed in the last few years has been an awareness that, you know what? The enemy's already inside the gate. And you need to now start to rethink what that means for your security. Because it changes things. It doesn't mean you don't want to stop them. Of course you do. But it does have some interesting implications. So if you think about just sort of the reality of where we stand, the technology has changed significantly. Mobile computing, cloud computing. The idea of perimeters doesn't exist anymore. It's dissolving. The Internet of Things we talk about. So, you know, last December there was a story about how a refrigerator was hacked and used in a spam attack. A refrigerator. Well, the thing about it is, like, what are they going to steal if they hack a refrigerator? They're going to know you have sour milk. They're going to know you're running low. What people don't realize is the refrigerator is just running a CPU. That Nest thermostat, yeah, okay, I can hack into it and figure out what your temperature settings are, but it's actually a CPU. The automobile, the 150 computers that are sitting inside the average automobile, they're just computers, and they can do a lot more than what they've often been programmed to do. So we're dealing with a world where the technology is far more complex. We're also dealing with a world of software, and our software continues to stay on and on and on. And so the number of vulnerabilities, simply, it is cumulative. The vulnerabilities of yesterday still occur. I go out there now, and I can't tell you how often I still see Configure-style attacks. I don't know how many people here remember Configure. Configure, what was it, 10 years ago? I don't know. It's 12 and a half. Whatever it is, it's as old as XP. And as did I. The point is that we're dealing with an ever-increasing and expanding technology, ever-increasing and expanding set of vulnerabilities. What about the actors? Who are we facing? Well, we're facing, they themselves have also evolved. So on one hand, we have criminal enterprises. Each one of these, by the way, has different motives, different techniques, tactics, and procedures, different capabilities, different things they're after. The criminal enterprises, they're after profit. So the best way I like to think about things, I use metaphors, probably also because after a couple beers it's all I've got left, but think in home security. So I'm the thief walking your neighborhood, and I'm looking for a house to rob. And I see one house has bars on the windows. Well, I'm out to make money, so I'm going to likely move on to the next house. I don't need the hassle. The criminal enterprise can be dissuaded because they're out to make a profit, but they're getting more sophisticated. They're going to the store and buying auto lockpick sets and more advanced things, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. They are getting more sophisticated, but they can be dissuaded. If a few years back I'd come up to you and said, hacktivist, nobody would have known what I was talking about. We used to talk about hackers back in the 80s and the 90s. Now we're talking about hacktivists. Well, again, let's go back to the metaphor. They're more like the teenager on Halloween's Eve that goes and eggs your house. Why'd they pick your house? Probably because they don't like the way you dress, they don't like your hair, maybe they don't like your car. They have an axe to grind. They're an activist, and they're using their means of protest. So they're in it for the lulz, they're in it for the glory. They are far less predictable. They're not in it for the profit. They are not easily dissuaded, but on the other side, they have very short attention spans. And they tend to be far less sophisticated. But that too is changing. So we'll talk about that. Some of the tools that they use and they share are getting more and more advanced. And so the techniques that the criminal enterprises have used start to bleed down. And then last but not least, of course, we have the nation states, cyber espionage. Richard Clark, one of our board members, he likes to say espionage is the second oldest profession. And it really is the second oldest profession. I don't want to talk about the first, but I will. These are the most sophisticated. These have extreme resources. It's estimated that China has over 30,000 people working for them whose job it is day in and day out as they get up, they go to work, and their job is to break into some network. One of our clients at Bit9, their domain controllers were under attack. And I analyzed the data that we had gathered, and we were protecting them. And it was always around the 6th or the 7th of the month, 6th, 7th of the month. And it was always, by the way, at about 2 a.m. You could sort of do the math Beijing time. But it was always around the same time every month for a 6-month period. And I thought to myself, I actually sat and I thought, why is it always the same exact time of the month that they're attacking this one customer and this one set of servers? And it's not hard to imagine, this is just their job. It's not personal, it's not like a hacker. Or their job, they have a list of the industry. Maybe it's oil and gas, maybe it's finance, maybe it doesn't matter, it's nonprofit. And they go down their list of companies, and like most people in the human population, we operate on a calendar, a Gregorian calendar, and so it's just easier for them to go on a monthly cycle. They go through their list every single month. And about the 6th or 7th day of the month is when they come across our client. They're going to get paid either way. Their goal is to get information. And they are the most pernicious. They're the most sophisticated. But one of the things that we're seeing, and one of the things that's scary about this, is they're starting to share technologies, and there's starting to be collusion. And that's where things get dangerous. So when you look at, and by the way, there's a fourth which we have yet to discuss, which is the cyber terrorist. The cyber terrorist is when the hacktivist combines sophistication with the nation state. Finishing that metaphor, the nation state, that's the stalker. That's in your neighborhood. They've picked your house because of something you have. You could put bars on the windows, they're going to crawl through the roof. You could put alarm systems in, they're going to keep coming in and day out. So they are the most pernicious. They cannot be dissuaded. Now, their goal, if you think about the different ones, in a criminal enterprise, if you're attacked, probably in about 6 months, you're going to start noticing suspicious credit card charges, or you're going to, if you're a company, your customers are calling you up saying, hey, what the hell's this? If you're a hacktivist and they've attacked you, you're going to notice the next day, because your website's going to be defaced or your passwords are going to be pasted on Pastebin. If it's a nation state, you may never find out. Or just once upon a time, someday, 2 years down the road, wow, they just put out a product that looks exactly like mine. Or I was involved in a negotiation to get a bid for X, Y, or Z, and they came in and they knew exactly what I was bidding and they undercut me. That's how it's going to work. So I think about this, and by the way, I'm not going to go through all of these, but typically when I talk about the landscape, I start going through the news, and I literally just grab the news from the last 6 months, 2 years. And the reason why I do, a couple things. First of all, it's mainstream now. I think it was said earlier, this is now the type of thing that your mom and your dad know, and they talk about over the water cooler. People actually, you can open up the Wall Street Journal every day and see a different article. But I look at them and I read different things into them, because sometimes it's not what they say, it's what they mean or the implications. I started with the Google hack. This was back in 2010. So how many people know about the Google attack, the Operation Aurora? Everybody here, this was the genesis of the mainstream use of the term APT, which has been used a couple times tonight. It's actually a DoD term dating back years earlier, but it stands for Advanced Persistent Threat. Couple misconceptions. It's not about the attack itself. The attack doesn't have to be sophisticated. It's about the attacker. It's that nation state, that persistent attacker. That's what APT stands for, or is meant to describe. And when Google came out and said, we were a target, and it wasn't just Google, it was Adobe, it was Juniper, it was a whole number of high-tech companies in California, people across the country said, other technologies and other businesses said, holy shit, Google just got hacked. Are we protected? Are we susceptible? And so the awareness, it was a sea change in awareness. And you can go through some of the others. Next step, that same year, Stuxnet. Stuxnet set up a fourfold. It was Stuxnet, Flame, Gauss, and I'm drawing a blank. Thank you, Dooku. These were, well, supposedly, whether it's Israel or United States, it doesn't matter. It was called at the time a cyber super weapon. Stuxnet was one of the few that doesn't follow your traditional attacks because it was actually an attack meant to target an air-gapped network. The most common tell of a targeted attack today is that it will phone home. That is the tell. It's going to be controlled by a human operator on the other end making command and control decisions. They're not your just viruses and worms of yesteryear. Somebody's making decisions on the fly. Stuxnet couldn't do that because it was targeting a network that had no internet access. So instead it targeted subcontractors, infected their systems, waited till one of the subcontractors of an Iranian nuclear program plugged in his USB stick, infected the USB stick, he went to work, infected the centrifuge. Now it's actually kind of interesting. I always find it fascinating because do you ever see like in Mission Impossible where I'm trying to break into a room, there's a camera in the room, and so the first thing I do is I take a picture of the room and I hold the picture in front of the camera. And then I can walk about freely. That's what Stuxnet did. So you had these centrifuges spinning, and you had a bunch of guys, technicians sitting there saying, hey, is everything cool, everything peachy keen? And Stuxnet reported back to the controllers, everything is fine. While it meanwhile sped up and slowed down the centrifuges till it physically damaged them, setting back their program anywhere from 5 to 10 years. Very sophisticated, very cool, used 4 0 days and so forth and so on. But the point was, what's interesting about this is it showed that, and we often talk about this, World War III will be fought on the cyber battlefield. And actually we see this already. We see this with Ukraine, we see this with Russia, we see that cyber is a unfortunate but necessary part of the world we live in today. RSA, what's the interesting note there? The interesting note about RSA is it shows the patience of the campaigns you're dealing with. So RSA wasn't attacked because the attacker wanted something out of RSA. RSA was attacked because the attacker wanted something out of someone who was protected using RSA secure ID tokens. It's a multi-stage attack. So RSA is attacked in day one to try and, this little key fobs for dual factor authentication to try and figure out the seed numbers in the formula. Well, the formula is public. The seed numbers, the master seeds, if you will. And then 3 months later, there were other attacks, whether or not, depending on whether or not it's true, but supposedly that the attacks on Lockheed Martin were based on that. And we do know it was the same attacker. But the point is that we're dealing with attackers. In fact, for example, China will often talk about their 100-year plan. We here in America, we're lucky if we can think past 4 years, the administration. Honestly, I can't think past this week. They're thinking 100 years. I'm a CTO of Bit9. My boss says, tell me what technology is going to be in 5 years. I can't possibly imagine 5 years. 100 years. So we're dealing with long-term plans. They're patient and they're very thoughtful. New York Times, another interesting change in tactics. So this is an interesting one that I pulled out because here's the story behind the New York Times breach. So the New York Times published an article reporting the amount of money made by the brother of the Prime Minister of China. Is it Prime Minister or President? Anybody know?
Premier.
Premier. The P of China. No offense, just I don't know what his title. But reporting the amount of money that the brother makes. China was pissed off. She was like, well, what the heck? So China hacked the shit out of New York Times. And the thing about that, and here's the point, now go back to those attackers. The hacktivist takes things personally. He has an axe to grind. The nation state doesn't. They're cyber espionage, it's their job. They're just stealing information because that's their job, to better their economy, to better their industry. This was personal. Not only was it personal, the point of the information they were going after, they wanted the sources, was intimidation. They didn't want information for financial or political gain. They wanted information for intimidation sake. And that's a new tactic. And so when I looked about this, and by the way, I was intimately involved in a number of similar type situations, when you start seeing an attacker who actually is starting to get a little hubris and actually take things personally, and then actually want to control the flow of information, it changes their motives, changes your risk profile. I'm going to skip through some of the others. There, like I say, some of the interesting, biggest DDoS attack in history. This was actually 18 months ago, 2 years ago, no, what is it, a year ago, in Spam House. And at the time it was reported, the biggest DDoS in history was the shot heard around the world that nobody actually heard. It's 300 gigabits per second. The average, by the way, DDoS attack, the distributed denial of service attack, is anywhere from 50 to 100 gigabits per second. You're pounding a server with bogus requests, and the server just gets so busy it can't answer. This one was 300 gigabits per second. And nobody cared, by the way. The internet didn't go down, it didn't crash, nothing happened. But when I read this, and I wrote a blog at the time, I said, what's interesting about this is the hacktivists just got themselves a new little tool. They like to give their tools names, by the way. This is the low orbit ion cannon. Yes?
Probably a dumb question, but when you say 300 gigabits per second,
yes.
Just thinking of the source, the WAN connectivity out of the source is probably much less than 300 gigabits per second. So it's in multiple.
It comes from multiple sources. Yeah, I'm not sure how they actually, it's interesting, I'm not sure how they do measure these from a central point, but these, the DDoS, distributed denial of service attacks, are happening from hundreds of thousands of locations. All making requests from a central location. Now you would think there's some bandwidth limitation at the central point, and that's actually the point. There is, and that's why the server gets so overloaded. Essentially, you overload the switchboard. It can no longer answer. If you can flood it with more than it can possibly handle.
I'm sure the ISP is the one who's measuring that, because they've responded before.
So they're probably on the backbone, yeah.
I've seen that in lesser attacks, where the ISP actually measures it.
Makes total sense.
Well, wasn't the attacker an ISP?
The target was, well, Spam House,
Right,
the attack,
the attacker was an ISP, correct? Because they were the ones that they felt getting filtered by
blocked.
Spam House.
Right.
Correct?
I'm not sure, like, or it was somebody who worked for them. I thought it was somebody with an axe to grind, to put it that way. But when I looked at it, I said the key here, and the thing to learn is, well, now we're going to see more. And no surprise, a couple weeks later, and I got it down here somewhere, just a month ago, 400 gigabits per second. Just a month ago, we saw a bigger one. It's like the new records. The other thing, by the way, I'll note, and I skipped over some of these, anonymous Arab cyber attacks Israel. This one bothers me. Why'd I put that article up there? Because that's hacktivists getting involved in cyber espionage affairs. And that's some of the crossover we've seen, and it's not the first time. When Sony was beat up, remember when Sony was, the hacktivists were just basically using Sony as a punch bag. It's the longest attention span I've ever seen in a hacktivist, because it was so easy. You know, you like punch somebody and they make a funny face, and you're like, I gotta punch him again. That's what was happening with Sony. And then in the midst of this, of being punched and punched and punched, 70 million credit cards got stolen, and they didn't show up on Pastebin. That's not the tell of a hacktivist. That's a tell of a cyber criminal. And so what happens is the criminals came in during the chaos of the hacktivist and used it for their financial motive. Yeah?
The Adobe one you have up there too, I think, is a real change in game too, right? So going after source code.
Going after source code.
We still haven't seen the full results of that yet.
Right.
These are government sponsored?
Yes. Yeah, these are generally government sponsored. They have the financial resources of the government, either tacitly, explicitly, or implicitly. But they have the resources and the support. By the way, the last, of course, it's be remiss not to put up the target one. It is now a board level issue. Security is a board level issue. CIOs can be fired for issues, and whether or not there was culpability doesn't really matter. The point is, it is a board level issue, and again, it just shows the increased visibility. Example of cyber attacks even in modern today, which is Russia and Ukraine, and Russia confirming that there are some level of this. We saw this with Georgia as well. It's where Russia attacked different things. cute little site. I just put it up here because I love this site. Informationisbeautiful.net. I love this site. It's a great, it's one of the few big data visualizations that, like, the buzzword actually works for me. It's very cool. It just shows a nice visualization of the size and scope, and you can hover over these things and it'll show you and explain to you of just the last data breaches in the last, I don't know what this is, last 18 months. Highly recommend it. The presentation, by the way, if you want it, we'll make it available. It's another way to look at it in terms of the presentations in the last 12 months. So a couple other ways to look at the data. Verizon, interestingly, I like Verizon. They have this thing called the A4 threat model. Stands for agents, actions, assets, and attributes. It's just a way to measure different types of attacks. So Verizon studied 471,000 security incidents in 2012. This is a 2013 report, and in the 2012 they studied 471,000 security incidents. I think it was 600 and something confirmed data breaches, and they came up with this diagram. The agent, who did the attack? 92% of them were external, as opposed to an internal. Insider threat, we hear about those a lot. 92% were external attacks. What were the methods, the action that they used? The overwhelming majority, the top two, malware and hacking. Malware, dropping something on there. So when Edon came up and talked about a vulnerability in remote administration or remote desktop services, somebody had to do that, either using hacking, which is somebody just typing the command, or malware. I had to drop something onto a system to gain control, to first get that hash that I could pass along, get the ticket, if you will. And there are others. Physical would be like I lost my laptop or somebody stole my laptop, things like that. Yeah?
Has there been noticeable similar attacks that have been successful against Chinese, Google of China?
Baidu?
Whoever. It's companies like that, Tencent.
By the way, Baidu is the Google of China. But
Baidu, Tencent,
Huawei.
Huawei is an interesting story if you want to get me started on Huawei. So Telecom, pretty big business. If you were to name the top 5 telecom providers right now, the top 4 of those would be brands we've all heard of for 20 years. One just appeared 5 years ago, Huawei.
Well, a little longer than 5 years ago.
Right. Sneaking in. And now they're like the top, I think they're the 3rd largest telecom in the world. Using technology, well, at least that's the accusation.
So one interesting story, you can go Google this, right? I used to work for Cisco, and at the time when I joined Cisco back in 2005, there was a class action lawsuit against Huawei, and they never fulfilled on it, but they brought them to court, and they showed the comment codes, right? So you write code and you put comments next to your code, right? And they brought up Huawei OS and they brought up Cisco iOS. And the only thing that was different was Huawei and Cisco name. Every comment code, they could go anywhere in thousands, tens of thousands.
So, right. Are we attacking them as well? Right. So to answer the question, yeah.
Plugged it in. So if you think they're not putting backdoors in their telecom switches to watch everything that's filing through them and sending back.
Yeah, my point isn't to single out China per se. Of course, the United States, other governments do cyber espionage. And so yes, there are attacks. They're not as publicized, but...
Right, so we were just accused for hacking Huawei systems, NSA. But I'm bringing up the point of 10 years ago, they ripped off Cisco iOS and plugged it into all their systems. And then they were selling all their stuff at high level into telecom in Europe and Asia.
So yeah, and the difference, at least certainly in ours, and we do hacking, everybody's hacking. The difference is that we all know about what the NSA is doing, or at least it's being reported in WikiLeaks and whatnot, are not in collusion with private enterprise. So it's just the system of government we have. Most private enterprises in China are also partially owned by the government. So when the Chinese government can take some information, they can benefit a private corporation. The NSA didn't give whatever information they stole to IBM, or take your pick, doesn't matter, or Cisco, to benefit. So you tend not to see the same types of attacks. You'll see information theft usually for whether it's G2, whether it's military intelligence, whether it's other types of things, but you tend not to see as much intellectual property theft in there. Now, there's other, like I say, there are other factions, Russia and others. Everybody does different levels of hacking, but they have different motivations. China just happens to be one of the countries that they just have a different, by the way, this is not a malicious or a malignment. It's a very different philosophy. They simply don't view intellectual property the same way we do. So yeah, assets. One of the things I like to say, by the way, networks don't get infected. There's no such thing as my network is infected. Your systems on the network are infected. And that's an important point to realize, which is at the end of the day, the attacker has to attack a node, has to get somewhere. And then we're going to talk a bit about that. And so you can see that the majority of attacks go after end user systems and as well as the back-end servers. A couple little quick numbers. I'm going to quickly go through this, so I don't want to take too much over your time. But there's other little sort of interesting, scary stats. 66% of malware takes months or longer, all from the Verizon data breach, and the Ponemon Institute did a similar study that talks about the time it takes to detect when you are breached. 69%, more than 2/3 of attacks were discovered because somebody came along and told you were attacked. Usually the FBI or the government, because they're watching different things, or a security institute. I think Engin pointed out, what is it, 200,000, 250,000 samples a day? Well, at least according to McAfee's threat reports in the first quarter of 2013, 155,000 new threats a day. And then different studies, these always get interesting to quantify, but $5.4 million, the cost of an average data breach. I don't know if that's accurate, maybe it's 1.4 million, maybe it's 10 million. It's a lot. It's a lot of money. So what can we learn from it? That's the scary scenario, right? That's the world we live in. Well, the first thing, lesson number one, everyone is a target. So one of the companies that we protect is a company based out of the Middle East, and they were hit, and we've defended them against the Flame attack. Now, Flame itself was a very specific espionage toolkit that was designed to gather information about certain operations within the Middle East. Now, I can tell you this company was not in an embargoed country, was not dealing with secret nuclear weapons arms, was not doing any of that. And they asked us, they said, well, why were we targeted? And the answer was because they do business with people in that region. So it's not just what you know, it's who you know that makes you a target. It's what I call often the Kevin Bacon, 6 degrees of freedom from Kevin Bacon. It's the Kevin Bacon attacks. And we live in a social networking world. If Kevin Bacon has been attacked, we've all been attacked. And it is, whether it's something you know, whether it's you've got something that's of value, profit to a criminal enterprise, or you've got something that's information to a nation state or to a competitor, or you know somebody who has something of value or to something of interest, or you just happen to annoy the wrong hacktivist in the wrong day because you said the wrong thing. Everyone is a target. And I can tell you I have seen the most sophisticated attacks launched against the smallest. One organization, I was talking down in Texas to a small tire company. The guy, it's a mom and pop shop, he manufactures tires. And he was attacked, and they traced it back to what they believe at least was certainly Southeast Asian IP addresses. And I asked him, I said, now this time I asked, I said, well, why were you attacked? He's like, well, I have an interesting way I make my tires. I use a certain little whatever. It's like the Colonel's secret. I make my tires a certain way. They wanted that formula. Lesson number 2, important. If I am a country and I want to create an army, I want to create a nuclear weapon, I got to go, I got to maybe recruit, I got to, conscript people, I've got to go get the materials, I got to go get physical material, I got to spend millions of dollars, I got to spend lots of resources to create an army. If I want to create a cyber army, I need 2 guys and a Google search engine. And we in the security business are as guilty, but as we rightly should as information sharing, of doing this. When Stuxnet was discovered, it had been out for a while, what did we do? We said, oh, we published it. Within 6 months, there were 4 copycat Stuxnets. The code is out there. Mimikatz that Idan showed. The code for that is out there. I can go out and I can download utilities. I don't have to be sophisticated. I can go out, I can download a utility, I can say, okay, I want an Adobe PDF file, I want to target Windows XP 7, and I want to target, Adobe version 3, 5, and 6, and I want, when they open this file, I want it to call back to the following IP address. I filled out a wizard, I clicked next, next, next. At the end, I got an Adobe PDF file that nobody's ever seen in the world. If you open it, it's going to call back to me. We've raised the bar. So when you see Spamhaus attacked, somebody downloaded a new low orbit ion cannon, and it's really got some new bells and whistles. And then it went to 400 gigabits. When we do our own research, we were just talking about the spy v spy. It happens all the time in the sandboxing game. We make a better sandbox, they figure out new techniques. We figure out how to bypass their sleep, they figure out how to sleep a different way. And when they do, guess what? They're talking, they're sharing. I'm a firm, strong believer in information sharing within the security community because the enemies are sharing. And that's why when you see maybe the most, going back to the threat landscape, you might see the most sophisticated attacks initiating from the nation states or the more advanced folks to use that visibility to be continually looking, constantly looking. And it is a problem of the sea of events that Egan was talking about. It's a big problem. We're going to talk a bit about that real quickly. But you need to be applying advanced behavioral indicators to look for suspicious behavior so that you have that early warning system. And you have to be able to respond to them when they happen. So I have been on countless different incident responses, and there are two different types of customers. There's the customer, or the company I should say, that has been breached, and you go on site and they go, we got breached, we got nothing. We don't know what they did, what anything. And so you have to sit there and pull hard drives. It takes on average 20 to 30 hours to forensically analyze a given hard drive, to read the tea leaves of what might have happened, and the attackers are pretty good at cleaning themselves up. And then there's the company that you go to that's been breached and said, here's our network logs and here's our endpoint logs and here's everything that's been going on. One of those incident engagements costs that $500,000. One of them costs $5,000. See if you can guess which. If you know the information and you have it recorded of every single file in your organization, which user was on there, what user wrote it, what processes launched it, what registry changes they made, what network connections they talked to, what other files they dropped, and where else in your organization those files went. And you are recording that in real time all the time. That's why Bit9, it's a tagline. I'm not big on the taglines, but it's incident response in seconds. And it's actually very true. I actually like the term, you're talking about automated malware analysis. I like the term automated incident response. When I